to welcome everybody. Um, I think most of you know me, but for those who don't know me, I'm Carl Witte. I'm the Vice Chair of the Delaware Military and Education Foundation, which is a parent organization of the Delaware Military Museum, where you're at right now. I'm not going to go into a lot about myself. I spent 21 years in the military, Medical Service Corps, regular Army. And I've been a volunteer here at the museum for, I guess about 10 years. Today, this is going to be a joint presentation between myself and Tom Reed. I'm going to go into a little bit more about my colleague. Tom was a Marine Corps veteran, and he's a professor emeritus at Widener University, Delaware Law School. He established the Veterans Law Clinic and provides free counsel to veterans. He's a Civil War historian who has published 3 books on the Civil War. His publications also include 2 constitutions. It's called 2 Constitutions, the Treatment of Dissenters in Time of War, which examines the legal implications of trying the German saboteurs by military commission rather than by civil court. And that's what he's going to talk about today. That's part of our presentation. He's a member of the Military Order of the World Wars, as am I, the Civil War Roundtable of Wilmington, of which he has chaired a number of years, and the Battlefield Preservation Trust. He's an active volunteer at the Delaware Military Museum, cataloging thousands of books here. And how many, Tom?
Sir?
How many books do we have in our library about?
About 6,000.
About 6,000. Okay, we're in competition with the band today. So he and Doug have been spending years, going through the books, cataloging them, inventorying them, and replacing them on the shelves. He is now embarking on establishing and build out of the Civil War room. A little bit of history. I was talking to Tom some years ago about this saboteur plot during the Second World War. And he said, yeah, he knows all about it. And we'll tell you about that in a minute. Also, the head of the team, George Dash, wrote a book, 8 Spies Against America. It's not properly titled because there's a difference in consequence between spies and saboteurs. But George, I don't think, knew the difference. When I was doing some research on it, I tried to get that book. It was out of print, out of my pocket. One day I go in to Tom. He says, Tom, Carl, look at this. And we had that book in our library. Again, there's 2 parts. The German sabotage plot, which I'll go into, which the majority of the lecture, because it really goes into the story, maybe more detail you want. And then Tom will talk about the relevance of civil liberatories. So here's the overview. We're going to talk about the plot, the planning and objectives of the operation, the truth of how the plot was foiled, the trial of the saboteurs, the verdict, and appeal to the 1942 Supreme Court and current challenge to 1940 Supreme as it relates to detention and trials of alleged terrorist detainees today. A little bit of background too. Before we get into this, when I was in about 9th grade, my family, my father was stationed in Germany. We took a tour through Italy. And my brother left my father's camera case on the bus. And the tour originated out of Frankfurt. And when my father realized that, my brother told him he had the bus stop, and he told a tour guide about it. And the tour guide, by the name of George Dash, said he'd pick it up the next tour through Italy. Well, the tour originated out of Frankfurt, and we lived in a place called Vilseck, which is about 2 hours away. Rather than mailing it, he hand-carried it down, spent the night, and after dinner he went into his story. And this is his story. George Dash was the head of the team, of the saboteur team. And he and accomplice Berger, who I'll get into in a minute, are the ones who foiled the plot. You may sense as we're going through this, I'm being a little bit critical of J. Edgar Hoover. One of my references I've talked to was an author by the name of Johnson out of New Jersey who wrote the book Hoover's Betrayal. I think the title kind of says it all. I got a call one day several years ago from a representative from WWII. He said, I just want to talk to you, because he was talking to Johnson and said, you're the only person alive that we know of that actually heard the story firsthand from George Dash. So here is the story. In 1940, the United States was not yet under the war. things were good. We had bumper crops, and there were employment was good. Okay, we were building things. Employment was good. But Hitler knew all was not well. He had easily taken Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Balkans, Belgium, Netherlands, and France, but England and Russia were formidable foes. German forces were halted by blinding snowstorms, frigid temperatures, and a stubborn Red Army. On June 12, 1941, FDR and Churchill signed the Lend-Lease Act that agreed to supply England with badly needed supplies. In the winter of 1941, Germany was in its third winter of war. Thousands of tanks and aircraft had been lost on the Eastern Front. High casualty rates began to cripple the mighty German military. The picture of Wilhelm Canaris. The Abwehr was headed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. The Abwehr composed of 3 divisions: intelligence, sabotage, and counterintelligence. Later, Canaris and other officials became disillusioned with Hitler and planned an assassination coup. He failed, and Canaris was executed along with dozens of others at Wolf's Lair, which we'll talk about that later. The intelligence division was headed by Colonel Erwin von Lahausen. Both he and Canaris argued that sabotage in the United States would be counterproductive. They and other high officials felt diplomacy would be more effective. But on April 16th, they were summoned by Hitler to a remote headquarters in Poland called Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair. Here, Hitler told them he intended to wreak havoc on the plan called Operation Pastorius. And then what happened in Japan? President Roosevelt announced that we were now at war. 3 days later, Germany declared war on America. Germany would now have to find a way to counter America's industrial power, and Operation Pastorius would be one way to do it. The wave of immigration in the 1920s was reversed in part by the Depression, making it difficult for once hopeful Germans to find jobs. So, by the mid-1930s, many had returned to Germany. Walter Kappe was one such person. Kappe had lived in the United States for 12 years and returned to Germany in 1937. He had joined the Nazi Party during its infancy and later joined the Abwehr with the intentions of using the knowledge of U.S. to commit, espionage operations. One of Kappe's challenges was how to get saboteurs to America. One option was to use submarines, or Unterboats, better known as U-boats. But Admiral Dönitz was opposed to the idea. Dönitz felt that his U-boats were better utilized on cutting American supply lines to Great Britain. By the spring of 1942, his subs had sunk 705,000 tons of Allied shipping with only 4 U-boat losses. But due to pressure from the senior party officials, Dönitz reluctantly agreed to the plan. On April 30th, 1945, after the death of Adolf Hitler, in accordance with Hitler's last will and testament, Dönitz was named Hitler's successor as Staatshaupt, or head of state. 6 months after the United States entered the war, most Americans were well aware of the war in Europe, but were far away and could not relate to the hostilities. Yankee Stadium was still full of fans. People shopped and worked and played much as they had before the war was declared. This is a picture of some of our attempts to monitor our coastlines, which was later a little bit criticized. This is a picture of Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he, at that time, was quite interested in espionage and that type of thing. He took an interest in that. This is a picture of J. Edgar Hoover he became director of the FBI in late 1924. He did not come into prominence until 1932. It was the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case that provided the FBI with much media attention, even though it was the Treasury Department that tracked down bills to the home of an unemployed carpenter named Bruno Hauptmann. $14,000 in transom body was found in Hauptmann's home. Yet Hoover took all credit for solving the case, as his press release gave no mention of the Treasury Department's role in helping to solve the case. The gangster era of the 1930s provided even more publicity for the FBI. Hoover declared one of the most notorious, John Dillinger, as public enemy number one. Here's a picture of two of the key public enemies, which is Dillinger and Babyface Nelson. The FBI received a tip that Dillinger and Nelson would be at the Little Bohemian Lodge in Wisconsin. Agents advanced on the lodge. When a dog began barking, two bartenders and these customers came out to see what the problem was. The agent opened fire, killing one of them. It was somewhat later of an embarrassment to the FBI, but they tried to keep it mum. A month later, an acquaintance of Dillinger's, Anna Sagi, he's a Romanian immigrant, told the FBI that she would help them in return for $15,000 reward money and a promise that she would not be deported to Romania. This is a picture of the three women who were with Dillinger when he was tracked down and killed at the Biograph Theater in Chicago. I am not sure which one is Anna. Anyway, she only received half the money and was deported. Special Agent Melvin Purvis led the team that tracked down and killed Dillinger. Hoover was delightful and immediately notified the press that the agents had tracked down public enemy number one. But the press did not report it to the way Hoover wanted. Instead, they gave Purvis the credit. 3 months later, Purvis tracked down another public enemy, Charles Pettyboy Floyd. Purvis was now a hero. In fact, they were thinking about making a movie of Purvis. And he ended up, by the way, Hoover putting Purvis in non-consequential jobs. Eventually, he resigned for the FBI and created his own detective agency. Born in 1903 in Speyer, Germany, when he was 16, he was watching some American soldiers play baseball. One hit a line drive and struck George in the head. This is George Dash, who will later become head of the team, by the way, the espionage team. They took him to the American hospital where he was treated. George was so impressed with the kindness of the soldiers and medical staff that he wanted to learn more about Americans and the home in the United States. He watched American films and learned all he could about the United States. When he was 19, he was watching the ships that come in and out of the docks. One day, he boarded a cargo ship named the Scholari just to look around. But then he realized that this could be his chance to get to America, so he hid away. The ship set out to sea. George was given food by the ship's cook. The crossing took 16 days to cross the ocean. When the ship docked at Snyder American Avenue in Philadelphia, George was relieved. But now he had a problem. How is he going to get off the ship? And then how is he going to get out of the yard? So he mingled with the crew as they disembarked and headed off the docks and the guard shocks. He was excited to be in America, but now what was he going to do? Since there was a larger German population in New York, Dash went to Manhattan, but before he settled down, he drove across America with two friends. He then joined the Army, later honorably discharged with an excellent character rating in September 1930. Dash married Rose Marie Goyer. After 17 years in the United States, Dash aspired for his citizenship, but he studied for the test, but never got around to taking the test and officially becoming an American citizen. And one day, George's mother came from Germany. George had aspired for higher things. He wanted to be an aviator, he wanted to do other things, but he never really amounted to everything. He was a waiter. Well, His mother was kind of chagrined that her son had not amounted to what he thought he would. So she persuaded him to return to Germany, where employment was high, things seemed to be looking up, and he had her brother, so it would be his brother, to get him a job with IG Farben, the big chemical plant in Germany. So he decided to go back to Germany. But things were difficult at that time, so it took months to return to Germany. But due to the non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler, the war with England and France, travel became a challenge. So he had to go through New York to San Francisco to Japan and Korea and Mongolia, across Russia, and finally back to Berlin. Dash expected his wife to meet him in Speyer, but when she didn't show up, he went to Berlin to see if he could get help finding out what had happened to his wife. He was introduced to Walter Kappy, whose picture I showed you with a little while ago. Kappy made some telephone calls and discovered that a British warship had taken Rose and other women married to Germans and German nationals to Bermuda to be held out until the end of the war. Kappy offered Dash a job as a radio monitor of U.S. broadcasts. In return for his services, he would be entitled to free dining and a luxury boarding house and an excellent salary. He would also be exempt of military service. In fact, he would be working for German intelligence, the Abwehr. Kappy's offer was too good to turn down. This is a picture of Edward R. Murrow, who was a famous broadcaster in those days. He quoted Churchill as saying Hitler was a bloodthirsty gutter snipe. Dash omitted the quote and many other things so as not to water down opportunities for Nazi propaganda. In December, Dash received a message from Kappy. He wanted to see him. Was he discovered by changing his messages? Nervous, instead, Kappy asked Dash if he wanted to return to the United States. After Dash questioning of Abwehr, Dash offered his position for Operation Pastorius. After Pearl Harbor, German intelligence began to screen all who lived in America. One purpose was to select qualified candidates who would be trained to form sabotage units who could infiltrate the continental United States and destroy industrial points. On April 11, 1942, Dash took a train to Quincy Lake near Brandenburg in Prussia. Here's a picture of that right in the middle of things. Now, Brandenburg is located in the middle of Prussia. Quincy Lake, where they were going to be trained, was a farmhouse. It was actually owned by a wealthy shoemaker, Jewish shoemaker, and the Germans took over. And the next picture is a picture of Berger, who was one of the candidates to be in the saboteur team. One of the first people he met was, again, Ernst Berger. They took a walk around the property. It became clear the place was not a farm after all, rather a training camp. Barns, classrooms, there were a chemical laboratory, a movie set with railroad tracks, an observation tower, and a house marked with bullet holes. Berger and Dash were then returned to Germany. Were told to return to Germany in 1933. For many years, many were screened, but only 12 were selected. The men were divided into three groups. Dash was head of one, Edward Curling head of another, and a man named Dempsey, the third, Edward the third. Curling lived in the United States many years, performing clerical and domestic jobs. He married a German girl, but eventually separated, then returned to Germany. This is Werner Thiel, a merchant seaman, moved from Germany to Detroit when he was 20. He worked for Ford and General Motors, but laid off, moved back to Germany for work. In 1919, this Herbert Haupt moved to Chicago when he was 15, moved to Germany because he got his girlfriend pregnant. Herman Niebauer came to the United States in 1931 when he was 21. He was a short order cook, married a German American, moved back to Germany in 1940, drafted and sent to the Eastern Front where he was wounded. Afraid he would be sent back to the front lines when he was offered a chance to join the group, he jumped into the chance. Okay, this is a picture of George Dash. He was a leader of the next group on his own team. Berger was born in, oh, that's Heinck. Okay, I'm sorry. Heinck, yeah, he was born in 1907 in Hamburg, married a fellow German. Oops. He had trouble finding work, so he returned to Germany. Richard Quirin was born in 1908 in Berlin, also a machinist, returned to Germany to take advantage of the Rückwander marks, money offered to the right to return to Germany to serve, about $5,000. Classes began at once. They learned how to make incendiary devices, fuses from common items, blow up bridges. By the end of the first week, three of the potential candidates had been dismissed. Training included a visit to the I.G. Farben aluminum plants, Farben Helping Aluminum Company of America, which they had actually collaborated with Alcoa. The team received instruction on how to sabotage aluminum plants. Some of the targets that they had planned was northern New York, New York City, Tennessee, and St. Louis. It included Hell's Gate Bridge, which of the East River, known as Hell's Gate. It was originally the New York connecting railroad bridge, the East River Arch Bridge. It's a 1,017-foot steel arch railroad bridge between Astoria and the borough of Queens and Randall's Wells Island, politically part of Manhattan and the Bronx in New York City. These are some of the locks along the Ohio River that were. The team visited railroad tracks in Berlin. U.S. targets included Horseshoe Curve in Glen, Pennsylvania. Now, this is a picture of Horseshoe Curve. Interestingly enough, my wife comes from that part of the country, and I used to visit that little museum that was there. And here's a picture of Horseshoe Curve from the air. And that museum, I saw some coal that was made. It was actually an explosive that they would put underneath the railroad tracks. So this is a picture of that, and they had that in that museum. Interestingly enough, I also a picture of this mugshot of George Dash. Now, one of his goals was not to blow up Horseshoe Curve, but they had that in the museum. I recognize this because when I was a kid, I had a book called Famous Spies and Saboteurs, and the story was in there, and this is a picture that was in the book, so I obviously recognized it immediately. New identities and cover stories were provided to each of the agents. Each was issued about $9,000 and an additional $50,000 to each team leader. That's a lot of money in those days. This is equivalent to about $2 million in today's money. And they had them inside hidden pockets in their vests, their shirts. Wooden crates were packed with blocks of TNT, explosives that looked like coal, detonators, and timers. Fountain pens concealed ingenious delay mechanisms for settling off explosives. Dash's group would land at Long Beach Island. Dash was familiar with the area, and there were long strips of beaches ideal for landing. Kallen's group landed in northern Florida near Jacksonville, called Ponte Verde Beach. The evening before departure, the team was invited to a restaurant named the Tiergarten. In attendance were several high-ranking officers, to include Colonel Van Leehausen. He told the group that if successful, they could inflict more damage than the several divisions of fighting forces. Walter Cappy addressed the group and revealed the meaning of the code name Operation Pastorius. Franz Daniel Pastorius was a leader of the first group of immigrants who arrived in the New World in 1683. They considered They consisted of 13 Quaker and Mennonite families who settled in a place known as Germantown, now a suburb of Philadelphia. Franz Linder was a captain of U-202. This is an example of the quarters used by Dash on the left and others on the right. You notice he got the kind of officer's quarters. The second team was transported on U-584, commanded by Joseph Deek. Deek sent a message to Linder that he would not be able to land the team until June 17th, 4 or 5 days after landing by the first team. U-202 was to land at Hampton, but served off course and landed in Armagoncet. The men boarded 2 dinghies to move from the sub to the shore. By the way, their orders were if they were encountered by anybody, they were to kill them. Dash then noticed a man walking down the beach toward them. Dash decided to approach the man. He noted he was wearing a sailor's uniform. The man asked Dash if they were fishermen, to which Dash replied they were. Rather unusual, since I think most of them were in coat and tie. He then asked how old he was, and he should do exactly as I tell you to. Then he put money in the guy's pocket. A lot of weird things that he was doing. And then he had him shine his flashlight in his face. Look at my face. Okay, I want you to recognize that when I have, you are called to Washington. He was already planning it. Now, what of course was a little bit unusual is that he didn't realize that this was going to keep it a secret. He obviously ran back to the Coast Guard station and reported that to his superiors. I might want to add that Dash, knowing by today, official diagnosis, he may have been a little bit bipolar or autistic. I don't know. He did some strange things, and that was an example of one of them, to put money in his pocket and then say, showing a light in my face. I can remember on the tour through Italy, my brother and I were sitting in the front of the bus, and we were coming on a railroad tracks, and there was about 6 railroad tracks. And the arm that was coming down was delayed. On the other side, it was kind of stuck. And he sits in, we were sitting right there, and he says to the bus driver, he says, "Geradeaus, schnell, schnell, schnell. Straight ahead, quick." So he gunned it and went in, and just as we got to the other side, the arm came down, and we were caught in the middle of the tracks. Well, fortunately, the train was on one of the far side tracks, so we really weren't in danger. But here we were young teenagers, and I thought, well, isn't that a strange thing to do with a bus full of people, to put us kind of in danger, because he wanted to get through that kind of fast. So seeing what he did with Cullen was kind of not a surprise. But Cullen was making routine patrol from the Armagoncet Coast Guard station about half a mile away. When speaking with Dash, Cullen was suspicious of Dash's comments. He overheard voices speaking in a foreign language. Cullen became nervous. The man thought Cullen seemed willing to let him go, so he turned and ran back to the station, where he reported the encounter to his superior, boatswain's mate, second class Carl Jeanette. The team set out to where Cullen had seen the man on the beach. Although the fog was thick, they saw an outline of a long-lying, low-lying boat. That was U-202. It had become lodged in the sandbar. Linder revved his powerful diesel engines in an effort to dislodge the sub. The Coast Guardsman could hear the roaring of the engines and smell of diesel fuel. He had limited training and no weapons training. Frightened that the boat may fire at them, they hid behind the fence. Later, Linder was ready to scuttle U-202, the tide came in, the boat dislodged, and Linder and his boat were able to back out to sea. When Dash told the men about the encounter with the Coast Guardsmen, Kieran and Heinck became angry at Dash and reminded him that their orders were to kill or capture anyone who they saw. After burying the boxes, the 4 men made their way off the beach. Dash told the others to wait, then returned to the site where the boxes were buried and stuck a shovel in the sand to serve as a marker. What Dash did not know was that Berger had also planted a marker, a half-filled bottle of German brandy, German cigarettes, and German sailor's cap embroidered with a swastika. Dash's team then boarded a train in Narragansett and traveled to New York, where they split up. Dash paired with Berger, and Heinck and Quirin went together. Dash and Berger spent the day shopping and had lunch at Horn and Hardart's Automat. I remember the friend of my grandmother's taking us to Horn and Hardart after going to a Brooklyn Dodgers and Yankee game. And I was about 5th or 6th grade. Later that evening, they went to Manhattan and registered at the Hotel Governor Clinton. Meanwhile, boatswain's mate Warren Barnes, who was in charge of the Amagansett Coast Guard station, notified the Coast Guard intelligence in New York. It was 1:45 a.m. In spite of numerous false sightings of suspicious activities, Lieutenants F.W. Nerschel and Sidney Franklin got in a car and sped from New York to Amagansett, arriving 2 hours after the call from Barnes. The officers took the boxes and comments back to headquarters in New York. Then the commander, Captain John Barnes, then notified the FBI. FBI took the boxes to the New York FBI office. Here is an FBI agent inspecting some of the contents. Hoover assigned his assistant Carl Conley to the case. Conley said that it was the most impressive array of sabotage supplies he had ever seen. There were no records to indicate that the shovel, cigarettes, brandy, or cap left by Dash and Berger may have been intentionally left additionally. In spite of the evidence, Hoover was skeptical of the man on the beach. Back to Manhattan, over dinner, Dash and Berger told one another about their dislike for the Nazis and the Reich. Berger was especially incensed about the way the Gestapo had treated Catholic priests and Jews when he was in prison. I never intended to carry out the orders, Berger told Dash. Dash confessed that neither did he. Dash told Berger, God brought us together. Now they needed to figure out how to tell the authorities before being caught. Back in New York. Berger had been an aide to Ernst Röhm, who headed the SS, which stood for Sturmgastling, or stormtroopers. The SS would eventually come to threaten Hitler's power, so Hitler had Röhm and other SS leaders executed. Berger was arrested by the Gestapo and spent 17 months in prison. Dash told Berger, God has brought us together. Now they had to figure out what they were going to do about it. Berger and Dash decided to call the New York FBI office. They were to meet Heinck and Quirin at Grant's tomb, overlooking the Hudson River. Berger and Dash were late for the meeting. Heinck and Quirin were irritated, not only because they were late, but because their efforts had been to leave, their orders rather, were to leave New York for Chicago as soon as possible. They were also divided as to how to get to the Amagansett to retrieve the explosives. Dash and Berger took a bus to 52nd Street and walked to Madison Avenue. There, Dash entered a phone booth and called the New York FBI office. Dean McWhorter took Dash's call. Dash told him he had important information for Hoover. McWhorter said Hoover was very busy, but that someone would get back in touch with him. Curling's group and U-584 landed without incident in Florida. Curling and Thiel traveled to Cincinnati, and Neubauer and Haupt to Chicago. As an aside, U-584 was sunk on 31st of October, 1943, in the North Atlantic. In a memo to President Roosevelt, Hoover said that German agents had been reported as landing along the coast from Georgia to Massachusetts. Of course, this was inaccurate. Hoover had also become critical of the Coast Guard. He felt that they were withholding evidence, which later turned out to be untrue. In fact, Hoover actually pressed for director of the Naval Intelligence to court-martial the two lieutenants. Dash had told McWhorter that he intended to go to Washington, D.C. on Thursday or Friday. Since he had not heard back, Dash decided to go anyway. Berger was to keep Quirin and Heinck busy. Dash wrote a note on hotel stationery and left $82,350. The note said to be used to fight the Nazis. After arriving in D.C., Dash checked into the Mayflower Hotel. Dash still had not heard back from the New York FBI office, so he called Army Military Intelligence. Colonel H.J. Kramer was not available. Anxious, Dash then called the Washington, D.C. FBI office. He was put through to Special Agent Dwayne Traynor. Traynor was, as it turned out, in charge of anti-sabotage, and Traynor had heard of the illegal landing in Long Beach. He told Dash he would have a car to come pick him up. Dash spent hours providing information to Traynor. One very important piece was that U-boats were able to dive deeper than American subs. This allowed German U-boats to go routinely to escape the depth charges. He also told Traynor that the 8th Air Force had been unsuccessful in damaging the submarine pens at Laurent because the concrete roofs were too thick. It is unknown if this information was ever passed to the United States Navy. Based on Dash's information, FBI agents began trailing Hank and Quirin. They picked them up around in the afternoon at Amsterdam and 82nd Avenue. They then went to Berger's room at the hotel, Clinton. They knocked on the door. Berger answered and said, "I have been waiting for you." Curling and Thiel had gone to New York. They were arrested on June 23rd in Manhattan. On June 27th, FBI agents arrested the last two, Haupt and Niebauer, in Chicago. Haupt had been visiting his uncle and his parents. The FBI then arrested Haupt's family members as co-conspirators or accomplices. Dash talked for several days. Traynor and Dash had Traynor said Dash had a split personality. Traynor did not seem to grasp the conflict Dash was feeling between doing what he felt was right and yet doing so against the country he was born in and the men he had trained with so far. In my opinion, many of George's personality traits seem to point towards being ADD, a psychological diagnosis not well recognized in 1942. This is a note from J. Edgar Hoover to Roosevelt. In essence, he lied to the president. In reality, Dash had turned himself in on June 18th. This is a promise made by Traynor to Dash, yet in order to better protect Dash's family in Germany, Hoover wanted him to plead guilty. Dash did not like this, but trusted Traynor and Hoover and went along with it. He would reluctantly plead guilty. The penalty for conspiracy, another word for sabotage, was 2 years and $10,000. This is not what the public or the president wanted. They wanted them dead. Walter Winchell was the most widely read gossip columnist of the time. One of his columns read, "The apprehension of the spies of G-men based on the slightest of tips will take your breath away," he went on. The most exciting achievement yet of J. Edgar Hoover's G-men. Winchell's facts were dead wrong. He, like many in the government and the press, did not know the difference between a spy and a saboteur, which carried vastly different sentences. This is another of Roosevelt's comments. Although he was joking, it was a poor case given the fact that, as commander-in-chief, he had the responsibility to decide the sentence of the defendants, and when the commission found them guilty. This thinking by FDR not only influenced the case at the time, but would be challenged 70 years later. We will see that in a moment. Another of FDR's comments, this time he was not joking. This one really bothered Attorney General Biddle, as he well realized that the president was challenging a long-held and valued legal precedent. As the prosecutor in the case, he may have to argue in support of the president's opinion, a position he did not want to be placed in. This is an example of the type of information being put out by newspapers. Again, a call for execution before knowing the facts and based on supposition and misinformation. Everyone, it seems, wanted the Germans killed. Carl Vinson, chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee, they ought to be shot since they are clearly our spies. Again, there was a difference, okay, in terms of the consequence of spies and saboteurs. And here he is, chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee. This is a picture of Myron Kramer. The United States did not want the German government to know how easy it had been for the would-be saboteurs to enter the United States. And this is a valid point, and probably one of the reasons why Hoover, who I'm being somewhat critical of, was probably taking the position because they didn't want the Germans to know that they could get into our borders and create the sabotage. So the closed trial, okay, of the military tribunal would be preferable. There was another reason. General Myron Kramer, the Army General Advocate General, raised the point. The maximum punishment of a district court would be 3 to 30 years. A trial by military commission, however, was not constrained by the federal rules of evidence, and there was no limitation on maximum punishment to include death. Secretary of War Stimson Kramer recommended to the FDR trial by military commission instead of civilian court. FDR agreed and issued an executive order to effect the July 2nd, 1942. Attorney General Francis Biddle, along with this was rather unusual for Attorney General and Chief JAG to serve as prosecutors, much less both of them, one or the other, much less both of them. Trainer to Dash, just before he told him the trial would be by commission. Soon after, Dash was taken before Biddle, Kramer, Hoover, and Provost Marshal Albert Cox. They wanted Dash to plead guilty. Since a commission was closed to the public and reporters then, why did they want him to plead guilty? Asked Dash. Again, he was told it would be to his best interest to keep the family safe. At this point, Dash would begin to believe that he was not being told the truth. The trial would be held in the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. The Germans were transported to from New York to D.C., but before the trip, Hoover wanted to meet the would-be saboteurs. Even though Dash had repeatedly asked to meet Hoover, Hoover deliberately snubbed Dash and did not see him. On July 8th, the prisoners under heavy guard traveled from district jail to the Justice Department. Along the route, citizens lined the streets shouting such things as dirty, rotten spies and Nazi rats. This is a picture of Carl Restine and Colonel Ken Royal, who were appointed as the attorneys in the case. Colonel Kenneth Royal had been working in the Office of Legal Affairs when he received the orders. Royal was highly respected in the military and civilian legal community. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He served as an artillery officer in World War I. Royal knew he had his work cut out for him, as the public pressures to convict was tremendous. He also knew that a military commission was not bound to the legal mandates of a civilian court. To be able to defend his clients properly, he needed to get to the proceeding transferred to a civilian court. These are some of the key figures at the tribunal. We don't have to go down all of that. This is the appointment orders for the trial. This is names of the counsel for the defendants. You notice they had 3 and Dash had 1, Colonel Restine. Now, was that done by intention? I think it was. He's a member of the military. Teaming with Royal was Colonel Cassius Dowell, and Captain William R. Hummel. The president of the commission, Major General Frank McCoy. The prosecution team. Note there are 5 of them. A little bit of outbalance maybe. The tribal courtroom, note Biddle and Hoover. I believe On the left-hand side, you'll see the bald-headed man, and right next to him is Hoover. They were kind of collaborating here, again, which is rather unusual, a team in a case like this. Royal and Dowell provided a biographical sketch of each of the men, portraying them more as victims of a system gone awry as opposed to the agents intent on destroying America. Each of the defendants was called to the stand to tell their story. These are the other four defendants. Although Colonel Royal did not provide as forceful nor as effective defense as did Colonel Rastine, did not provide a forceful defense as did Colonel Royal. He did manage to persuade the court to accept into record Dash's 245-page testimony to the FBI. He was also able to divulge the FBI's promise of a pardon to Dash, something Biddle had not been told by Hoover. Royal and Rastine arguments were in vain. In the end, all were found guilty by the commission. The day after the trial, Royal visited Chief Justice Black. Biddle accompanied him. The purpose of the visit was to appeal to the Supreme Court to call a special session to consider to have the case renewed by civilian court. Rastine did not accompany Royal and Biddle. I do not know why. Black agreed that the court could hear the case. The decision was significant because it pitted the power of the presidency against the authority of the court. By the first time in 22 years, the Supreme Court had agreed to convene when it was out of session. A major concern of Biddle's was that the defense would invoke the tradition of habeas corpus. This is Latin for "you have the body." In legalese, it is an old principle that prevents people from being held by executive authority without turning them over to legal constituted courts. Okay, I'm going to touch on this a little bit, more detail of the legal aspects of it. But in 1862, Abraham Lincoln issued a presidential proclamation establishing a military commission by trial against insurgents. The decree, in effect, suspended habeas corpus. In other words, authorities could sentence war crimes troublemakers to long prison sentences and even death without civilian court review. Lyndon B. Milligan, a northerner from Indiana, was supporting the states' rights and supplying arms to the South. He was arrested under suspicion of distributing arms to the South and to assisting deserters. He was tried by military commission and sentenced to death. A lawyer himself, he knew that his best chances to save himself was to appeal under unlawful imprisonment. His legal counsel, at least one of them, was an attorney named James Garfield. The two argued that the government had violated the Constitution by imposing martial law. If now you're wondering if the James Garfield is being the same person who was later elected as President of the United States, the answer is yes. By the way, Milligan sued the military for the imprisonment, the false imprisonment, and the jury awarded him $5. By a vote of 5-4, the 1864 Supreme Court issued one of the most significant defense of civil liberty in American history. The justice concluded that the federal courts in Indiana were always open to try cases like Milligan's. Therefore, under the Constitution, no military court could try them. However, shocking the charges, the defendants kept their rights under the law. Ex parte Milligan had never been overruled. Royal knew that. This 78-year-old case offered his clients to the best chance to avoid execution. Royal argued that he was, as was the case with Milligan, unless an enemy soldier was detained within the theater of operations, he was entitled to the same legal rights as anyone else in America. Justice Felix Frankfurter, a European-born Jew, the most conservative on the bench, countered by saying that the enemy determined the theater of operations through acts of aggression. Royal also argued that the president's proclamation violated the manual for courts-martial by requesting a review by military judge advocate defense being sent by the commander-in-chief. This was not done. Biddle argued that it was impossible to compare the East Coast today when we were at war with a foreign country, as was with Milligan in Indiana. Royal said that the law distinguished between intention and acting on that intention. In the case, nothing was carried out. Justice Stone argued with Royal. The other just felt that the position may cast doubt on the president's powers. Since it seemed that the debate may drag on for days, Stone reluctantly recanted. After a short recess, the justice reconvened and read their decision. The petitions were held in lawful custody, and motions to file for unit of habeas corpus denied. Royal says the court has acted. Roosevelt spent 3 days reviewing the tribunal transcripts. Biddle recommended to FBR that Dash and Berger be shown clemency. The president agreed. He sentenced death sentences. He sentenced Dash to 30 years and Berger to life imprisonment. Hank, Quirin, Curling, Thiel, and Neuberger were executed on August 8, 1942, in unmarked graves. They were buried in D.C. in Potter's Field. Colonel Roy vigorously defended the plans and the Constitution to face a determined president and a bloodthirsty public. He was a model judge advocate. He was later promoted to brigadier general. He served in the Undersecretary of War from November 1945 to July 18, 1947. He was president, and President Truman named him Secretary of War in 1947. Both Berger and Dash were sent to district jail, then transferred to a federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Traynor appealed to Hoover, and Hoover's response. You can see that there. He said it was ill-advised. After the war, Truman commuted the sentences for Dash and Berger, but deported them back to Germany. This is a little bit of how Truman felt about Hoover. The FBI is tending in that direction. They were dabbling in the sex life scandals and plain blackmail. J. Edgar Hoover would have his right eye to take over, and all congressmen and senators were afraid of him. Actually, he was keeping book on Eleanor Roosevelt and a bunch of people, the Kennedys. He didn't like the Kennedys. As a matter of fact, I think after President Kennedy was shot, he picked up the phone to call his brother and says, "Your brother is dead," and hung up the phone. That's the rumor. I don't know how true it is or not. But from what we know about J. Edgar, it's probably true. The historical importance of Operation Pastorius in Quirin Supreme Court was not foiled Saboteurs' plot, nor the trial and Saboteurs' execution of the Six, rather the importance of how, after September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks George W. Bush and the 1942 precedent to justify the use of military commission and the detainment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. On October 24, 2001, Congress passed the Patriot Act with the intent to deter and punish terrorist acts in the United States and around the world, to enhance law enforcement investigatory tools for other purposes. In 1942, when Congress played no role in the prosecution of the Germans, today, though the passage of the Patriot Act, Congress declared that military tribunals may be convened to try non-citizens for violations of the law of war. The Act further states that such individuals cannot seek remedy in the United States. In 2004, the Supreme Court began to hear challenges to the President Bush's order. The first case was Rasul versus Bush. The Supreme Court held that federal courts have habeas corpus jurisdiction to review the legality of the confinement of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. In effect, this reversed the decision of the 1942 Supreme Court. Too bad Royal was not alive today to witness this. The second case, Hamdi versus Rumfeld. Okay, I'm not going to go into the detail. These were, again, cases. He held that the president does not have the power to hold United States citizens indefinitely. Justice Scalia's comment and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's comment. And then again, Hamden versus Rumsfeld, another case. It was probably the most recent. I don't know, unless there may have been more after this one. Congress was responsible for changes and updates to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Therefore, to make changes, to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, in other words, the President order to the military tribunals violated both military and international law. In November 2009, President Obama announced plans to try some individuals held in Guantanamo Bay in civilian court. As of today, no decision has been made for many of the differences, unless Tom wants an update on that. And then it came to a head during the Boston Marathon with the debate over security versus civil liberty, use of military tribunals, and presidential authority, as was the first introduced in the Civil War and introduced during World War II and throughout the decade. We look at the future, we can expect that there will be continued debate over the use of military tribunals versus civilian courts for those accused of terrorist-type activities. Statistics seem to point towards the effectiveness of our federal court system.
Speaking to large groups of people in very big rooms, so this is not a problem for me. My little part in this, and it's a very little part, is to talk about the conflict between two sections of the Constitution. The second article, which defines the power of the presidency, and the Fifth Amendment, which grants to every American and every resident alien due process of law. Because that's what the Quirion case is really about. Because President Roosevelt invoked the war power in sending the 8 saboteurs to be tried by a military commission without having the express authorization of Congress. And this is going to come up in our time, in the early part of this century, dealing with some of the individuals that we had to deal with after 9/11. From September 1939 to December the 7th, 1941, the United States did not join the Allied side. The USA was neutral and could not give aid to the Allies under the Neutrality Acts. So we couldn't even furnish one bayonet or one bullet to the Allies without having to reciprocate and furnish the same to the other side under the Neutrality Acts. The public did not favor U.S. involvement in World War II. Now, none of us in this room are old enough to remember the Deutsche American Bunde, the German-American Bund, or the White Knights and other organizations that were very distinctively pro-German, pro-Nazi, and conducted parades. And I guess nobody in this room, but maybe me, has ever listened to anything by Father Coughlin, the Catholic priest who also advocated a dictatorship like that of Adolf Hitler. Not every American was sympathetic to Great Britain, and for good reason. But Franklin Roosevelt concluded he could not bring the U.S. into the war on the Allied side. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire was involved in a prolonged war in China. Keep your focus on this. The Chinese conflict is what precipitated our entry into World War II. Because Japan needed access to oil, needed access to rubber and other raw materials that could be found readily in the various colonies held by France and by Great Britain in the Far East. And the Dutch, let's not forget the Dutch. So there was only one huge problem: the United States fleet, based at Pearl Harbor. Our line of battleships, our aircraft carriers, most of our destroyers and cruisers were home ported in Pearl and could easily intercept and block a Japanese attempt to seize any of the colonies of Great Britain, France, or the Netherlands, which precipitated the surprise attack in 1941 and brought us into the war in a way that only Americans can get. Both feet and both hands, jump in and win this thing once we're in. More than 10,000 resident German aliens were detained under the Alien Internment Act during World War II. Schwarzkopf, an Austrian Jew, successfully challenged his detention on the ground that he escaped from Austria before the Anschluss of 1938. Those of you familiar with European history in modern times, there was a so-called, quote, vote among various ethnic groups in Czechoslovakia that resulted in Austria becoming a satellite to Hitler's Third Reich, the so-called Anschluss. In German it means assuming or coming together. Hans Lüdecke, a German national who fled Germany after Hitler's takeover, tried to prove that he was not involved in the Alien Internment Act because he fled Hitler and his awful regime. But Lüdecke lost that battle and he was interned. You may not know this, but German spies had penetrated the U.S. government in the late 1930s. There were two agencies responsible for this. You've already heard about Abwehr because Carl gave you a pretty good quick view of how Abwehr was organized up to 1944 when it was absorbed by SD, the intelligence agency of the Nazi Party. Now to our scenario. In 1942, 4 Abwehr agents were disembarked from a submarine off Long Island, as Carl said. They carried high explosives and had a mission to sabotage U.S. war production by blowing up factories and dams. This is the most puerile and brainless form of sabotage I have ever encountered. Any of you who ever worked in counterintelligence, this is third grade level. 4 more saboteurs were landed in Florida to do the same thing, come up by train into the heartland of the Midwest and blow up some factories. Now, George Dash, one of the Long Island 4, had second thoughts about blowing up factories and dams. And Carl's talked to you a lot about the background regarding George Dash and why he had a motivation to change colors and turn his people in. So he turned himself into the FBI, identified all the other 7 saboteurs who were promptly rounded up and charged with treason and conspiracy. Broad-based. President Roosevelt and General Marshall, Chief of the Staff of the United States Army, decided that saboteurs could be tried by a military commission rather than in a civilian court. They, like Secretary of War Edwin Stanton during the Civil War, were concerned that if this case went before the jury might find sympathy for the defendants and let them off without imposing the extreme penalty of death. In fact, none of these people were charged with crimes, as Carl pointed out, that could result in the death penalty under the United States Code at the time. They didn't murder anybody. They didn't conduct any actual sabotage. There was no arson on their part. Nothing that could bring in the death penalty. I like my picture of George because it's a little bit sharper than the average. And that's his mugshot taken after he turned himself in by the FBI in New York City. You've alluded to Ken Royal, who was one of the great unsung heroes of American legal history. He defended the saboteurs, other than Dash, who had his own private counsel for some reason. He decided to challenge the constitutionality of trial by military commission, relying on ex parte Milligan, a case decided way back in 1866, and we'll talk about that very briefly this afternoon. So he filed a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of Richard Quirin in the District Court for the District of Columbia, which had both jurisdiction and venue over this military commission, allegedly. Obviously, the District Court said, wait a minute, military commission is not subject to civilian law, writ denied. Before Royal could take a notice of appeal across the street to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, he filed a direct original habeas corpus petition with the Supreme Court. It's very rarely ever done. At that time, it was even questionable whether you could do that. Today, it's pretty clear you can't. The various changes to Title 28 U.S. Code, the Code for Law and Procedure before United States courts, have taken direct habeas corpus jurisdiction away from the Supreme Court. But Royal was doing everything he could to save his clients. That's what lawyers are supposed to do. Why was he doing that? Way back in 1866, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the conviction of Lambden Milligan on charges of treason. He was tried and convicted by a military commission seated in Indianapolis, Indiana. What was he tried for? A number of so-called copperheads, that's anti-war Democrats, had colluded with Clement Vallandigham, a very left Congress member from Dayton, Ohio, and Confederate agents in Montreal to bring arms and munitions into the United States, arm other copperheads to descend on Chicago's Camp Douglas during the Democratic Convention, and liberate 10,000 Confederate prisoners who would then march south to increase the war, and also help in the severance of the northwestern states, i.e. Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, and Minnesota from the United States as a separate independent nation. You might say that's a fool's errand, that it had no chance of success, but at the time, both the Confederate States of America and the Copperheads, so-called, the anti-war Democrats, were willing to stick their neck out on the issue of the continuance of the United States. Well, suffice to say, the plan never went off. Nobody freed the prisoners at Camp Douglas. The United States quickly rounded up most of the leadership of the Copperheads that were going to take the great leap forward and free prisoners from their location in Camp Douglas, and tried the individuals by military commission so there would be no civilian sympathy for these people. What you don't know is that a substantial part of the public in Indiana was extremely and virulently anti-war and very pro-democratic. They were committed to supporting General McClellan for president on a platform that the war would be ended by a negotiated settlement. That's all this pushing back and forth. Well, needless to say, Milligan and his Confederates were convicted. He was sentenced to die, but his lawyers ran over to the U.S. courthouse in Indianapolis and filed a writ of habeas corpus. At that time, Justice David Davis, the United States Supreme Court, was sitting as circuit justice in the district for Indiana, Ohio, and the Illinois, which was one big district of appellate jurisdiction in those days. The circuit judge, properly sitting there, said, no, we have no jurisdiction over this military commission. We can't touch it. That was not what Justice Davis did. He said, very short and sweet, I disagree. The court has jurisdiction. The writ should be granted. Well, you got a split between the two judges sitting in judgment on this case. In those days, it precipitated an automatic appeal to the United States Supreme Court. That got us into the Supreme Court, where the majority of 5, as Carl pointed out, specifically held that in time of war, United States citizens sitting and residing in states that were not under immediate threat of invasion, where the civilian courts were open, could not be tried by a military commission, period. What you didn't hear is the dissenting opinion of Chief Justice Chase and the other 4 members of the court. They held that, yes, we can try civilians by a military commission if Congress authorizes specifically trial by commission for certain cases or people. And now, since there was no congressional authorization, Lambden Milligan should go free. That's going to surface in the 21st century. It's going to surface in the hands of an opinion in one of the cases we're going to talk about now. Hamdan, you showed Hamdan's picture. Hamdan of Rumsfeld was where it was presented to the court that because Congress had not authorized President Bush to try any of these detainees by military commission, his very long, prolix, and rather well worked out system for trying people by military commission appeared in the military commission rules passed by the, passed into history as a nice try. Congress promptly voted express authorization to President Bush to try detainees at Guantanamo and other locations by military commission if they were not U.S. citizens. Therefore, trials, as I think you pointed out, Carl, there have been 7 successful convictions out of Guantanamo and 1 case still pending under express authorization by Congress. So you've got one group of justices saying that the president has no innate power under the war power to send civilians before military commissions, and another group saying the president may not have innate power, but Congress can give it to him. They also have a problem going back now to ex parte queering. These people were charged by crimes under Articles 81 and 82 of the Articles of War, which have to do with espionage. If any person is found lurking in a military installation or in or near a military installation, this is the Articles of War, with intent and purpose to gather information or otherwise spy upon the United States, they shall be punishable by death. Congress provided for that in 1892. That's a very, very old part of the Articles of War. But you see, these blokes never got closer to a military institution than listening to music on the radio. They were hanging out in big cities on the tab of the German Abwehr, buying drinks, getting along with people. Article 1, Article 2, they had no violation of it whatsoever. But we charged them with it anyway, and by God, we're going to prove they're guilty. And indeed we will. Just for your record, I'll read Article 82. I don't think anybody here is old enough to ever have to serve before 1950. Am I right? That's when the Articles were superseded by the full blast of the 1947 Uniform Code of Military Justice. Under Article 82, any person in time of war who shall be found lurking in acting as a spy in or about any of the fortifications of posts, quarters, or encampments of the armies of the United States shall be tried by general court-martial or by military commission. Express congressional authorization. Well, it didn't quite fit what went on. Royal argued on the basis of the Milligan case that his clients should be freed or the process dismissed and referred to the United States District Court for indictment under the usual procedure for criminal cases. The Supreme Court took cert from the District of Columbia Circuit as soon as the District of Columbia Circuit, sitting in an emergency session, affirmed the District Court and said, okay, we're not touching this case, it's not us, we have no power over it, it's a military commission. Well, so we got a direct petition for habeas corpus filed by Colonel Royal, followed by an ordinary appeal, but an emergency docket from the District of Columbia Circuit to the Supreme Court. The case is adjourned, oral argument is held, and the upshot of this is very interesting. You realize that 3 of these people were United States citizens, naturalized. Do they have any rights? Well, not before this tribunal. They were treated no more better than the individuals who were simply resident aliens like George Dosh. Did the Fifth Amendment due process clause apply to these individuals? Were they entitled to the full due process of law? I'm not going to bore you with all of it. Were you entitled by trial by jury by your peers, the right to know the charges against you before you are put before the court? the right to call counsel, to have counsel? Were they? What's so important about that? They're guilty. Why do we have to bother with all this nonsense? That was the attitude of the time. You saw some of the clips that Carl ran. That tells you something. That's why I wrote a book about the treatment of dissenters in time of war. We seem to lose our sense of perspective, and instead of following the Constitution as it has been interpreted, we have this special Constitution for time of war, which grants the President extraordinary powers and the Executive extraordinary power to handle problems efficiently, quickly, without the foo-for-ah of protection from the law provided by the Constitution. And many people think that's all right. The court held in the Tuened case the President, acting under the war power, could try these 8 individuals by military commission, despite Milligan. Impliedly, the court held the war power could trump the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, construing Articles 81 and 82 of the Articles of War to include the saboteurs was a great expansion in military law, and one that never saw any light of day after this case. What I will tell you is the court was able, in their own mind, to distinguish the holding in Milligan because it only applied to natural citizens and not to naturalized citizens. Nice trump. You came here, you learned all about the United States, you passed the test on the Constitution, you were sworn in as a citizen, but you got no protection because you're not a native-born citizen. Well, what's more striking is that case actually came up. The distinction that I'm talking about was neither artful or intellectually honest. The Bush administration used Quirin as a precedent for setting up trials, as I said before, by military commission without congressional authorization for the Guantanamo detainees. Now to the case that nobody knows about, Gimple and Colpaw. These were, in fact, spies trained by the Abwehr and dropped by submarine in Maine in 1943. They were the usual inept German spies. They were quickly rounded up and caught while walking down a highway towards York, Maine. And what are we going to do with these people, the executive said. Well, we'll try these birds by military commission. But wait a minute. Colpaw was a native-born American citizen. He may have turned traitor, he may have been serving the interests of the Third Reich, which we abominate, but he was an American citizen, no matter how you slice it. And you can't revoke the citizenship of a naturalized American, or a non-natural, but a natural-born American, excuse me on that. Both men were sentenced to death by a military commission, and only the end of the war and President Truman's grant of executive clemency kept them from being executed. So that's a quickie brush on some of the law that's at stake, and it really boils down to this. If the war power is such that it trumps the Bill of Rights, then the Bill of Rights is just a piece of paper in wartime. If not, then the power of the president, especially when applied to citizens of the United States, whether they're naturalized or not, or to resident aliens. Way back in 1887 or 8, the Supreme Court decided that a naturalized American citizen and a resident alien were entitled to protection under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the one that was granted after the Civil War, preventing states, in the case of Yickwo versus Hopkins, from denying rights of due process to resident aliens. That same precedent slopped over now into the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, although not expressly and specifically so. So, that's what we left with. We have all gone through the 9/11, some of you unfortunately far too much to your own happiness and future world. We've seen people rounded up, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, who were involved in the 9/11 affair, who were fighting against U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Most of those individuals, if you've been keeping score, have been released without trial and sent back home. It seems some of our Afghan allies realized the Americans were paying money for turning in freedom fighters for the cause of United Arab Caliphate. So they started picking on their neighbors. They didn't like turning them in for the money. So a lot of people just swept up. There were some true terrorists in the group that have been remained, and they're only, I can't give you a number about how many are still in Guantanamo that's still classified. There's still people awaiting trial in Guantanamo after 20 years. Why bother the trial? We wait long enough, they'll die before we have to try them, huh? So that's my brief restatement and summary of the law that's at stake in the Quirin case. Who has the trump card? The President or the Fifth Amendment? And with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I want to thank Carl for an extraordinarily detailed and accurate presentation of the facts underlying Quirin.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's outstanding. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Tom, and Josh, for providing your support. And,
Thank the 287th National Guard Band for giving us a company throughout the first part of the presentation.
yeah, they were a background. So, well, Godspeed. Habst du ein sehr gutes Reisen. Thank you very much.
Yeah.